Hi, and welcome to the seminar Reimagining Human Mobility, co-hosted by UNDP Sweden and the Nordic Africa Institute. My name is Anders Bolling. I'm a journalist and a writer, and I will be moderating this seminar today. This is the first seminar in the UNDP seminar series called Reimagining Development, and there's a hashtag to that, Reimagining Development. The series aims to contribute to a deeper conversation about the future of development by exploring how we can reimagine the ways in which we address the major challenges of our time. First, a few notes on the technical setup of this webinar. During the call, participants will be muted and their video will be disabled. As long as you can hear and see the speakers, everything functions as it should. If you have questions, you may submit them in the webinar during the webinar using the Q&A function, not the chat. We may not be able to address each and every question, but we can promise that we will do our best. And this webinar will be recorded in order to be shared after the event. So, without much further ado, I would like to introduce Therese Sjömander Magnusson, Director of the Nordic Africa Institute, who will share some words of welcome. The floor is yours, Therese.
Thank you so much, Anders. Good afternoon, and on behalf of the Nordic Africa Institute and UNDP, I would like to welcome you to this seminar on reimagining human mobility. We are experiencing times of increased inequalities, growing power asymmetries, and economic downturn. But where countries hopefully will soon start opening up their borders, a deeper discussion on this topic couldn't have been more timely. As a representative of a Swedish public agency established by all the Nordic countries some 60 years ago in support of the freedom and solidarity movement in Africa, I truly appreciate the collaboration we have with UNDP. Yes, we have different mandates and different scopes of work, but we share the same commitment, and that is to focus on African voices, perspectives, and African agency. Earlier this week, the Nordic Africa Institute organized a roundtable with thought leaders from Africa and Europe, where we focused on Nordic contributions to future EU-Africa relations. In essence, how the Nordic countries can bring forward alternative perspectives and genuine ownership in support of African solutions to African challenges. As a point of departure for our discussion on Monday was the realization that development is more than economic growth, and that meeting people's social needs has to be at the center. Establishing and investing in a strong social contract within and between societies is fundamental to meet the challenges we have ahead of us. Because if we don't address this, we will fail to capture opportunities for sustainable societal transformation. So therefore, concepts such as collective identity and solidarity needs to have a regained place in the debate around development and global governance. And I personally believe that understanding the motives and the dimensions of human mobility lies at the very heart of that discussion. The theme of this webinar here today, Reimagining Human Mobility, reflects a growing interest linking migration to development, which opens up new avenues for linking migration policy to Agenda 2030, and also for bringing migration issues into dialogue with a broader field of development research and policy thinking. We know that African migration remains a politically divisive issue. But we hope that this webinar today and the work that both our organizations are doing offers new perspectives on how to think about and how to engage with the links between human mobility and development in more productive ways. I'm very proud that the Nordic Africa Institute co-hosts this seminar together with the UNDP today, and I very much look forward to a reflective and deepened discussion with all of you. So with that, thank you so much and a warm welcome back to you, Anders.
Thank you so much for that opening speech, Therese. Mobility is an integral part of human behavior. And as such, it's also a natural part of development. People have always migrated to find work, to study, to be with a loved one, to look for new perspectives, or just to search for a better life in general. And historically, the primary driver has always been labor demand. The number of migrants in the world is increasing. But the proportion of people who can be defined as migrants has been remarkably stable, actually, over the last half century or so, at around 3%. And that today translates to some 270 million people. The majority are illegal workers who often move to a neighboring country. And this sum total, the 270 million, also includes tens of millions of skilled professionals and other affluent people. Refugees, who often are at the center of the conversation about migration, they constitute about 1/10 of all migrants, or 25 million people, give or take. There are a number of so-called undocumented immigrants, and they have often arrived in their country of destination legally, but then overstayed their visa. So how many are undocumented? Well, around 20%, a fifth of all migrants are irregular. But only 1% are subject to smuggling. You might say that that's 1% too many, but still a lower number than you often would think from the debate. Because sadly, as you have noticed, most of you, I guess, the narrative about migration in politics and in the media is, for the most part, one that is significantly more narrow-sighted and problem-focused than the true big picture. This year, we are all living in very strange times, and during this pandemic, big flows of people have been forced to pause. Perhaps this could be an opportunity to reimagine human mobility, as United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has put it. Maybe it could be an opportunity to handle things a little bit better once the flows re-emerge. We will delve a little bit more deeply, I think, into that issue, the effects of the pandemic, during the Q&A section towards the end of the webinar. Now, to set the stage for this seminar, we will now be screening a short video from the UNDP report, Scaling Fences, Voices of Irregular African Migrants to Europe. And the video illustrates the motives that people have for migrating.
L'objectif, c'était pour gagner l'argent. Penser maman et puis papa. Avec les grands chers, petits c'est pour les aider. Donc, c'était la pression. Mon pression, c'était ça. Voilà, héros.
Je veux bien partir, étudier, avoir de bons diplômes et puis revenir servir. rehausser mes capacités personnelles même, et comme ça pouvoir revenir au pays et rehausser le drapeau ivoirien.
They like to have something. We don't have nothing here. Me also, I want to go. Maybe God will help me.
Let's agree on one thing. We will never stop migration. This is a phenomenon that is quite normal. Migration is the global challenge. Many of them that are leaving the continent are saying that they are doing it for a better life.
Mais l'idée, c'est pour ne pas peut-être aggraver la migration, c'est de voir les causes, ces politiques impérialistes qui poussent les gens à migrer, les politiques de nos gouvernants qui enracinent les gens dans la pauvreté, à ne pas développer les choses pour les écoles qui n'existent pas, la santé défaillante, et la corruption, la répression. Ça pousse les gens à voyager. On ne devrait pas trop se focaliser à empêcher les gens de venir, mais c'est de voir les raisons qui font que non, les gens puissent migrer. Les gens ont beaucoup de raisons pour migrer. C'est tout ce que je peux dire. Ça, c'est très important.
I would now like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers for this webinar. We have Ahuna Ezeakonwa, Assistant Secretary General of the UN and Director of the Regional Bureau for Africa, UNDP. And we have Torbjörn Pettersson, Senior Advisor at SIDA and former Ambassador to Sweden to Ethiopia. And we have Jesper Bjarnesen, Senior Researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. Fantastic to have you all with us today. Now, Ahuna, an opening question to you. Based on UNDP's work in the area, Africa, where you are based, could you shed some light on the main patterns and drivers of migration from Africa to Europe? Why is it that people make these often very difficult journeys?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anders, and good afternoon, everyone. Really a pleasure to be sharing this platform with the illustrious colleagues from the Nordic Africa Center, but also from SIDA. And I want to thank the co-host for giving us an opportunity to reimagine human mobility in the context of the future of development. It's a report, the reported snapshot you just saw on Scaling Fences, Voices of Irregular African Migrants to Europe. It's something that UNDP were really proud of this report because it does take the migration debate away from an academic exercise to the humanity that is behind it, as you saw in those stories. And let me maybe highlight three of the key findings that shed some light on the question you just asked, Anders. One is that irregular migration must be understood as part of a development journey, the development process. It's, as you said in your opening, there's a historical and fundamental link between irregular migration and the development process. And the second is that the story of those who have migrated irregularly is not one, it's actually one of desperation, but not the kind of desperation that we imagine, which is often, people are so hungry, they are running to go find food and shelter. It's the kind of desperation that people are in search of a better future. The individuals who embrace this search are those whose development trajectory is already in ascendance. There are those who are leaving, those living irregularly from Africa to Europe collectively and paradoxically represent a positive story of development gains on the continent. They're not the elite, that's for sure, but the research reveals that respondents had manifestly benefited from development progress in Africa in recent decades, particularly significant progress on the continent in relation to education. So the ones that we spoke to are not the illiterate group of people. The capacity also to irregularly migrate and the appetite for greater opportunity, as well as a sense that aspirations would not be met in their own home countries, have been sharpened by improving development context. And the third is that irregular migration is also a story of a development progress that is not fast enough, and with gains that are uneven and limited. So this results in widespread perception that ambitions have surpassed opportunities at home and forcing many to seek their dreams abroad. The overall youthfulness, for instance, of the respondents and the bleak perspectives on governance context at home point to a very strong sense of identity-based social exclusion and also alienation from state duty bearers. 62%, for instance, of respondents felt that they had been treated unfairly by their governments. We also saw high levels of disappointment in the quality of services provided across all respondents, particularly in economic opportunities. And then 80%, the vast majority of respondents reported that they were not involved in politics at home. And 77% felt that their voice was unheard, or that their country's political system provided no opportunity whatsoever through which that they could exert influence on government and governing. Thus, irregular migration serves also as a clear evidence, first, that development is taking place in Africa, and second, that it is not happening fast enough with gains that are uneven and also limited. Perceptions that opportunities to fulfill aspirations at home are closed held also profoundly that it has led to the radical rejection of their circumstances to scale these metaphorical fences towards personal fulfillment and better opportunities at home. So it is not usually what we see on the surface. You know, these are individuals with incredible capacity, both in terms of intellectual capacity, but also deep ambitions to improve not only their lives, but the lives of their families and communities and their countries. And they are prepared to do whatever it takes to pursue those dreams. And I think what this report also pointed to is the need for the discourse of migration to move from just a point of desecularization to changing policies from ungoverned to governed migration, because we see the development potential of this. And this will have to be built into the Africa-Europe partnerships, which require a reframing of how we respond to the realities of the readiness, for instance, of the European labor market to absorb migrant workers, and also the incentives and barriers to return to the return of irregular migrants. We have to ensure that irregular migrants that have already arrived in Europe, for instance, are able to access safe and productive livelihoods, and that they can help mitigate social and political fallout rather than the reverse, which is, I think, often discussed. But also in the discussions, we saw that expanding legal pathways for migration in and between Africa and Europe would effectively enable the migration governance system to catch up with reality by pulling policy frameworks firmly into the 21st century, advancing new approaches to governing irregular migration, as well as building a stepwise shift in the discourse of irregular migration in and between Africa and Europe. So maybe, I don't know, Anders, I may have taken already my 5 minutes. I can come back to some of the recommendations that we have in the report later on.
Sure, we will have the Q&A towards the end, of course, so we'll have possibility. But just one follow-up question here. What you were describing about the driving forces was more, to me, sounded more like a story of power and hope rather than of desperation, actually, which is kind of interesting to some extent as well. Anyway, do you think, or would you say that the motives among these people who decide to move have changed over time, or have they been the same all along? Have you seen any changes there?
I think that the fundamentals of why people move is basically standard. It's remained the same. There is a hunger out there to match their dreams, their opportunities, their ambitions to opportunities that they see elsewhere. But also, I think the overall desire to live a life where you can choose, where there are, options. Whereas, in many of these countries, people feel that basically there are no options and there is no hope. So I think that chase, that sort of race towards where there is hope, where hope can be fulfilled, has always been a driving force and a motivation for migration, for migrants.
Yeah. Great, Ahuna, thank you very much for that interesting talk and answering that question in a very interesting way. And we'll come back to these aspects, as we said. Now, Torbjörn, I would like to ask you about development and migration, because development and migration are closely interlinked, of course. And in what ways do you think that migration is catalytic to achieving the global goals for sustainable development, the 17 SDGs? And how does SIDA work directly or indirectly with human mobility?
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and thank you both Anders and Ahuna for your introductions. I think you both have very sobering perspectives on migration and mobility. As you said, Anders, the picture that is often painted is that migration is a problem, a hindrance to development. So thank you very much, and I think it's very useful to, in that sense, reimagine whether it's because of COVID or not. It's something we have had to do for a long time when we talk about and think about migration. Of course, migration, as you pointed out in the introduction, involves both opportunities and challenges for global development. And to start, of course, giving the mandate that SIDA has to eliminate poverty, we tend traditionally to be more focused on mitigating the negatives impacts of migration. So a lot of what we have done traditionally is about working to improve the situation for refugees, for internally displaced people, and those 2 to 3% that we read about, because that's what we do. However, for a couple of years now, we have turned our attention a lot more to strengthening the positives of migration, to see how we can use migration also as a catalyst, as you said in the question, or how we can leverage the many positive effects we have. We mainly work with mobility as an indirect part of other programs, be it health or education or governance, which I think is very often, as Ahuna pointed out, the most important area. So the main area of support today reflects, of course, these ambitions or this mandate to work with the biggest problems, if I say so, the negative aspects of migration. So a lot of it is about durable solutions for refugees and support to refugees hosting communities, access to education, to refugees. We know the terrible state of many of children living in long-term refugee situations. And we also work especially with environment and climate change effects of big, say, involuntary migration. But I would like to say a little bit more about what I see as maybe the other side of the coin, and where I predominantly myself has worked quite a lot the last years, is how can we strengthen the positive aspects of migration. In Africa, we have developed quite an ambitious approach now in our work with that objective. So first of all, we support the African Union together with the IOM and ILO in strengthening labor migration within Africa. You mentioned the disproportions in the pictures we have on migration statistics, Anders, and one of them is that we are very much focused in the debate on the migration from Africa to Europe, and I think that's what 2-3% of migration in Africa, something like that. So our main focus is to strengthen labor mobility within Africa, because that's where the big opportunities lay in integrating Africa, in creating stronger livelihoods for Africans. We also are working together with the African Institute for Remittances with the objective of making it cheaper and easier to send money back home. We know that source of income is, first of all, globally bigger than development cooperation, and I think in Africa almost as big as ODA, official development assistance. And we also know that it has an extremely high poverty reduction impact. And that's been very obvious in a negative way during COVID, because when the remittances stopped, because people were out of jobs in the Middle East or Europe or wherever they were sending the money from, that immediately had a very negative impact on the poorest of the poor, on poor households back home who were relied on these remittances. So what we do is to try to support financial institutions, banks, in making this easier. I think a remittance, I don't know the exact figure right now, but it's like 4 or 5 times as high a cost to send the remittances to Africa than anywhere else, and also within Africa. So that's another area where we work. And finally, just not to take too much of the time now, we also do quite a lot of work to help states better manage migration together, because very often when you have a migration situation or a spike in a migration due to conflict or humanitarian crisis of various kinds, it takes more than one country to solve the problem. So, for example, the Horn of Africa, what we sometimes call the IGAD region, is one very seriously affected by migration in all directions. So we try to work with and support those states to develop their migration systems, to try to have a joint approach to migrants, and also to get better statistics, because if you don't know where the migrants are, who they are, how many there are, it's very difficult to elaborate good migration policies. So those are some of the areas that we do, and as I said, of course it affects almost every SDG in a positive way as an opportunity, but also in a negative way. We tend to be more on the negative side because that's our mandate, but I think we are increasingly looking also for the opportunities created by migration. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Torbjörn. Well, the negativity bias is also possibly a human trait among all of us. Yes, you mentioned the remittances, which was really, I think, important in this context, because as far as I remember, the sum total of remittances is 5 times as large as the total ODA in the world. Is that correct, or do you have the figures?
My figure is between 3 and 4 globally, and Africa, which has more ODA, I think I don't know what a couple of years ago when I checked, where I was giving a speech like this, yes, and I checked the figures, at that time it was on the same level.
Okay.
And
yeah,
also
that makes sense.
Same level as FDI.
Makes sense that
so,
Africa,
yeah.
in Africa, the proportion is different. So
Yeah.
anyway, it's a big chunk of money helping people in all parts of the world. You also mentioned another interesting aspect, which I didn't mention in my opening remarks, namely that the bulk of migration in Africa is within Africa. And as you said, the proportion of African migrants who actually go on these rickety boats across the Mediterranean is just a trickle. It's very, very little part. And that's one misconception probably among the public. And as in the general conversation, as you said, migration is mostly seen as a problem to be solved rather than a means to development. So besides this misconception about where the African migrants mostly go, which would you say are the main misconceptions about migration that creates problem in this context?
Well, I think, I mean, the main thing is that they are seen as victims, and I mean, Ahuna said it all. I mean, these are extremely capable individuals, often driving development. I mean, migrants have been extremely important in developing my country. I'm very proud to say that Swedes were very important in developing the USA when they left Sweden, because we were very important. But you know, it's like the debate today, you don't get that. It's this victimized. And of course, we need to focus on trafficking. We need to focus on the fact that migrants must have rights, that migrant children must have education. So I mean, of course, we are part of that problem. But when you start working with mobility and migration, you see so many opportunities. You see how technology and skills and knowledge is spread through migration, and it's really, you know, we say the headline, but I think we need to repeat it, and we need to think about what it means. That migrants are so often a driver of development, and I mean one just to talk about one misconception from the Swedish debate finally, which I think is you know, a bit challenging to handle in the Swedish debate, which we are not to discuss here. But sometimes people are given the impression that if those poor countries increase their GDP per capita a little bit, migration will stop. And everything we know is the total contrary. Because as you get more developed, you have higher mobility. You move more. It might be circular. You don't leave your country for good always, but the mobility will keep on increasing. So, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but for those who think it's a problem, that you know, increased development will increase mobility and migrants. And I think that's a good thing. And to strengthen the positive ways and orderly migration must be very much about understanding that this is not a crisis. This is something which shows that we are growing together.
Thank you, Torbjörn. That last remark there was perhaps a segue over to Jesper and his research. I may come back to that, but I would start my opening question to you, Jesper, is just a very broad one, since you are a researcher, and from your perspective, as a researcher, which broader picture of African migration dynamics and dimensions do we need to take into consideration? Very broad question, but from your perspective as a researcher, how would you answer that question?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. I think in this context, you know, maybe my role is primarily as perhaps an outsider to the more, you know, operational competences of the other speakers, because there is such a high level of knowledge about migration and mobility already among you. But I would emphasize three different entry points to perhaps thinking differently or broader about migration. And the first is history, the second is proportions, and the last is geopolitics. And much of this has already been mentioned in the previous intervention, so I'll be fairly brief. But I think that speaking about the historical contextualization of human mobility, there is a lot to say. But if we just think about African migration towards Europe, I think one point is that the restrictive way that migration is managed now is fairly recent. I mean, up until the 1980s, African nationals with the means to do so could move quite freely back and forth between Europe and Africa, and they did so. And that also meant that many migrants left and then came back. They didn't settle as permanently as we sometimes see now, because people are afraid that once they leave, they might not be able to come back. So those dynamics are quite recent, which is important to remember. I think it's also important to remember that up until 2008, there were more than 400,000 legal entries by African nationals to Europe, but that number dropped to half, almost half, by 2012. So it's a quite recent development that there's been a restriction in the number of legal entries, which I think tells us something about the proportions between irregular and legal migration, that with fewer legal options, the irregular path becomes more tempting perhaps for more people. I could say a lot more about this historical awareness, but I think that just overall, it's important to remember that things have been different in the past, and there's a potential to think differently about migration at a very fundamental level, even in the future. So that's just to evoke a more sort of historical awareness. Just very briefly about proportions then as the second entry point. We've already heard that irregular entries to Europe are back to a pre-refugee crisis level. So there's not sort of an ongoing crisis in terms of irregular entries to Europe. We've also heard that the majority of African migrants never leave the continent. They migrate often within the same sub-region, which is important just to keep proportions in mind. And then also, it's important to acknowledge that the global stock of African migrants is actually smaller than the global percentage, the African population in relation to the global population. So there are fewer African migrants per capita than there are in other regions, right? So it's not that there are loads of Africans leaving the continent, however you see those numbers. Yeah, again, I could say a lot more, but I think it's just useful to use proportions perhaps rather than just numbers in and of themselves to put irregular migration to Europe into a broader context. And then finally, to say something about geopolitics, it's sometimes the elephant in the room, and it's also something that's difficult to do something about. But I was thinking about, there's a late sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman, and he said, this is 20 years ago, he was talking about globalization, and he said that human mobility has become the defining resource of our times. And he was talking about the fact that human mobility has become a resource for the privileged to travel the world freely and easily, while the majority is sort of held back. So in that sense, also, human mobility is a resource. And I think there's a political dimension there that we should kind of acknowledge and try to work with. And it is the fact that this resource is contested. It's something that's fought over. There's a fight going on about who controls people's mobility, right? And I don't think this should discourage us from engaging with the issue. And there are many ways of doing it. It's not just about discussing migration politics over the dinner table or even in parliaments. It's also acknowledging that, similar to other resources, development actors have an important role to play in fighting for a more just and sustainable distribution of this access to human mobility. That's a way we can frame our thinking around human mobility, is that it is a resource that is withheld from some people at the benefit of others, and we can help sort of in the spirit of global solidarity that underlies also the 2030 agenda. We can work to making the access to this resource more fair, I would say. So these are just some very broad perspectives. Of course, there's a lot of more specific ideas we could talk more about later, but I just wanted to bring these bigger thoughts into the picture as well.
Excellent, Jesper. Well, you mentioned this, the fact that the governments are the ones who are deciding who are allowed to cross borders and who are not, and it's a bit of a sad perspective to think that governments are often very eager to have things and services be able to cross borders, but not people, which is what we're talking about today. And to get back to what Torbjörn was touching upon, that the fact that if these poor countries, the relatively or absolutely poor countries in Africa, get richer, if their GDP rises, then we will not see a drop in the number of migrants, rather the opposite. And it's because As far as I understand, also, it's not the poorest people who are sitting in these rickety boats on the Mediterranean. And it's also, as far as I understand, not the people from the most conflict-ridden areas, which it seems that the public in Europe and also politicians in Europe often think. Can you say something more about that?
Yes, I very much agree with Torbjörn's perspective on this as well. So both in relation to what we would call voluntary migration and different kinds of displacement, it's definitely true that the people who are able to leave their immediate sub-region are the people who have some means. This goes for refugees as much as it goes for economic migrants. It takes resources to move. I've heard politicians say, well, if we tell this to our voters, won't that discourage then sort of willingness to invest in development? Wouldn't we sort of implicitly be encouraging voters to not want to invest in development because that risks sending more migrants towards our countries? And that again comes back to the narrative that I think you have all sort of alluded to, that there is this highly politicized narrative around migration as a problem and as a threat to the stability of the wealthier countries, which is completely out of proportion. And I think in addition to the issue of development leading to more migration, there's also the concern about population growth in Africa, that with the projected population growth, we will see massive flows of migrants leaving the continent. And again, that's where I think the proportions are extremely important. It's still a relatively low number of people, especially who migrate irregularly. The vast majority migrate legally to work, to study, as you evoked in the beginning as well. So yes, I agree that increased development will lead to more migration, at least on the short and mid term. But I think that the key issue here is how we manage migration. And there is, first of all, a tendency for stricter border control to lead to migrants settling more permanently, because there is a lack of opportunity to travel back and forth, to be mobile rather than resettling. So I think much comes back to the issue of governance. It's not that migration in itself will stop. It would just take forms that vary depending on the interventions we put in place to regulate migration. So again, it's about not giving into this idea that migration as it in and of itself is a problem, but rather it is a resource that needs to be governed and managed in a similar way as other resources.
Yeah, human beings are resources, not problems. Thank you very much, Jesper. So we reached the Q&A section in this webinar. And I think that, as I mentioned in the beginning here, I think we need to address this very particular point in time, this particular situation that we are in this year with regards to migration. So after nearly a year of COVID-19, as we all know, having shaken the world, and the people's movement has more or less come to a halt. What are the pandemic's main consequences for human mobility? What are the main consequences from this pandemic for human mobility? And I think this question is addressed to all three of you, or four of you. No, three of you, sorry. Maybe Ahuna could start by trying to answer this question.
Thanks, Anders. And very important points raised by both Anders and Jesper there that I hope we can come back to. But on the COVID-19 impact or consequences, I think already remittances was mentioned. I have some numbers here showing that in terms of the socioeconomic crisis and the way it's impacting global remittances will drop by $109 billion, according to the World Bank, affecting 800 million people who rely on the cash that they receive from remittances for livelihoods and social security. For Africa's remittances, we're seeing a projected drop of 23% as a result of COVID-19. Most affected countries will be also the most populous countries, Nigeria being one of them, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia as well. And the second, so there is that impact on remittances, a very important resource, as mentioned earlier, actually now surpassing ODA in terms of consumption, building up the consumption capacity of populations. So that will drop. And with that, there are also not just human development consequences, but also economic consequences, because when you have lower consumption rates, the economy is also going to suffer. The second impact I see, and this is more internal to Africa, is, a lot of cross-border trade and mobility happens on the continent. We have 270 million people who live in Africa's borderlands. And the way these livelihoods are created is really through cross-border mobility and trade, because a lot of these populations are far away from the center. They're in the periphery, and they kind of fend for themselves by their ability to move back and forth with services. COVID-19 has put almost a halt on the mobility across borders of humans. Services have been allowed to continue, goods and services have been allowed to continue moving, but people have been stopped because of the fear of the expansion of the infection. And this is a huge disaster because you see then the immediate stop of halting of livelihoods for a huge number of people. Also, 70% of those who trade across borders are women. And we know that women businesses are the ones who actually feed families and education. 80% of any business done by a woman goes right back into social development. So the fact that the vast majority of those economic activities that require human mobility are undertaken by women who then support their families means that the crash that we now see with COVID-19 has a huge impact. And then lastly is on the rights of those who move. Again, this was alluded to by Jesper, who is guaranteeing what rights to who, to be able to utilize this resource. I really like the way you put it, Jesper, that the human mobility is a resource, is a human resource, is human capital. And the powers that be determine who accesses it. It then becomes, we start to go in the region of human rights and the inequality that is also generated as a result of this closure. So all our interventions for COVID-19 recovery must be migrant sensitive. We must have this lens of the impact. It's easy to be forgotten and left out, when we're talking about leave no one behind. This is one domain where people can be left behind because they are less visible. We need to look at what's happening to people on the move and how COVID-19 is affecting them, and put in place along that chain measures that will also guarantee their protection, but also their right to continue to earn a living and a livelihood. Back to you.
Yes, excellent, thank you. And you viewers and listeners out there online, if you want to ask questions, you can use the Q&A function to do so. Would you like to add anything to this, Torbjörn, about the effects of COVID-19 on migration?
No, not a lot, because I predominantly, I think Ahuna mentioned the the main effects we will see, remittances being number one in the short run. I think maybe what we don't know yet, but there's a fear, at least in my mind, that we hear quite a lot now about the global value change being disrupted, and we hear of new strategies among investors to stay closer to the markets, i.e. to if you want, as a European, to bring the production home. And that there might be a reason for us to think more about how to promote that kind of mobility, which is it's movement of capital, but it mobilizes a lot of human mobility in Africa, especially with a big new African free trade area. So there are increasing opportunities of reaping the harvest of globalization in a way they haven't done before. So I think it's very important not to halt that process, which has been quite positive, I would say, the last 4 or 5 years of African economic integration, bringing financing for development, as we call it in our jargon, to Africa in a size that you haven't seen before. And I hope that this disrupted value change and change of priorities of investors can be fought back once we see the more positive development of COVID.
Okay.
And Anders, may I add one thing on the COVID?
Yes.
I think it's the opportunity that it presents for us to reopen the debate on migrants and their contribution to development. Because if we look at the frontline workers right now saving lives, I was very moved to see a report of a South Sudanese refugee who migrated from there to South Africa under irregular circumstances and almost lost his life. He's now one of the leading medical practitioners, doctors, saving lives with a new method of protecting the lungs that are affected by COVID-19. We are seeing more and more stories of the incredible power of this mobility of populations with their skills, or who also are so resilient that they develop the best skills. I mean, those who have suffered the most, they say, sometimes have the most to give.
Yes.
And we're seeing this pay off in this COVID response. And I think it's an opportunity, really. And yes, but this is, for the researchers, this is a really good case study to see what are migrants contributing to the response to COVID-19 as frontline workers. You go everywhere in Europe, in this country, in the United States, a lot of those on the front lines are migrants. And this is not even, I mean, it's lost to the world, because at the same time, this phenomenon is presented as the most negative consequence of development today. And yet it has such a power behind it in terms of its positive contribution to humanity and to development.
Thank you, Ahuna. Powerful story. Do you want to catch up there? I mean, answer that directly, Jesper. You were addressed here.
Thank you. Well, I won't be able to say it as eloquently, because I was thinking about sort of the positive aspects as well, that this attention to essential workers in Europe, for example, does help us switch the narrative a little bit on migration overall. And then I would just mention that there's also the secondary effect of sort of general global recession, in a way that affects a lot of livelihoods, even when migration is not particularly governed. So internal mobility within countries where people need to move for different forms of trade or agriculture or other fields of work are also affected, because there's less business going on, there's less money circulating. So there's just sort of this general effect of the pandemic on livelihood options, which of course also affect internal people who are internally mobile. So that's just to add to what has already been said.
Yes, and many of the people who are working in the healthcare systems in many countries are migrants, and this is of course at the core of the fight against COVID-19, the health system. So that's one very concrete problem. If there are not, it's not possible for people to arrive. So another question is about, and maybe this is for Jesper. It's about the security lens that we often have when we debate this thing. Migration is seen as a problem, as a security problem. You mentioned the geopolitics of it all. So how can we supplement this narrative in order to have leaders, the public, see this as more of a nexus between to more clearly see the nexus between development and migration? How to do that? What's your suggestion, Jesper?
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I think there is more talk now about this need for shifting the narrative. We published a small sort of policy reflection in January called Shifting the Narrative on African Migration, but we've also seen this year's annual report from the IOM using the banner of Shifting the Narrative to sort of argue that there is a need to change the political view on migration, and public opinion is kind of implicitly understood that there is a need to convince voters in Europe, especially, that migration is not just a problem. So yes, there is this issue that is receiving more recognition. The way I would frame it, and it's not new in itself, but it's perhaps a different way of seeing it, is I think we need to switch the logic when we think about the migration development nexus. So what mainly is happening now is that migration is being inserted, or rather development is being inserted into migration governance. For example, the idea of addressing the root causes of migration, which is about trying to use development to prevent further migration from Africa to Europe, right? So there, development is used as a tool to govern migration. I think we need to switch that logic around. I think we need to think about how, and I think Torbjörn was evoking that as well, how we can insert migration into development policy rather than the other way around. So to think about skills partnerships between continents, but also how to encourage movement within countries and within sub-regions as a means to the end of development, right? So I think fundamentally, if we just talk about shifting the narrative as a principle, I think we will end up in the same political deadlock that we have still between African and European perspectives. But if we think more concretely about how to use migration and mobility as a driver for development, as has already been said, I think that's really where the key is. So it's about switching the logic in that nexus. It's a very abstract answer, but I'm an outsider to the operational aspect.
It was an abstract question, so and so shifting the mindset, perhaps in a way, seeing it differently. So another question for Torbjörn, or if Torbjörn do you want to add anything to what just was said about the geopolitics and that aspect? Torbjörn, no? I think you have to unmute. Okay.
Yeah, no, I do agree very much, and I think Jesper put it better than me, that we need to rethink this, and I mean, I did it a bit, countering the kind of migration negative rhetorics that we hear, that when they try to see, as you said, Jesper, development as a tool to stop migration. I mean, we need to start thinking the other way around. How can mobility, like in Africa, I mean, what I mentioned, the biggest program we've done in Africa is about seeing mobility as a way of integrating Africa. I mean, Africa is one of the poorest economically integrated continents of the world, by far the poorest. And one of the reasons is that you haven't been able to use mobility. It's very difficult to work in another African country and continue to have your social welfare or whatever it is. So I fully agree with that.
Yeah. So Torbjörn, if we are to see now mobility and migration as a tool for development, what solutions would you say are available today or in the near future to facilitate safe and inclusive migration? This has been in the debate, but not lately. Actually, it's been about the problem aspect of it. But what solutions are available to facilitate safe and inclusive migration, with the goal, of course, in the end, that migration becomes a choice, a positive choice?
Well, I can't say that I have. I might think about that as you know, citizen of Sweden of tools here, but that's not really the line of work I've been doing. But we spent quite a lot of time on looking at what tools do you have in Africa, in intra-Africa mobility, how can we increase it, and so on. And I mentioned briefly the African free trade area and the ambitions to integrate that. I think is what's happened so far is the normal. People talk about the customs of various goods and services and what is essential for to protect and so forth. We've had the same debate in Europe historically, but we are quite sure that within a year or two already, once you start implementing this, rulers, investors will start focusing on human mobility, because that is how they will make gains, profits, increase productivity of this free trade area. That's what it will be about. So that opens up a kind of another way of talking about mobility, not seeing it as migrants fleeing away, but as an opportunity and a bit of competition for migrants. I mean, it's quite because to put it bluntly, I mean, the African free trade area means that a lot of global capital will turn to Africa because you have a much bigger market. Now, where that capital ends up will depend on, among other things, how good you are at attracting migrants to this, building the infrastructure, actually partaking in the production, innovative solutions to how you can use. So I think that is one tool to look at the safest of all bets is to go with the market. I mean, if there's an economic interest behind it, you will see that there is a value of migration and mobility, and get out of that, as you may, what you call the security lens, which is very much there, not only in Europe, but also within Africa. I mean, we see this happen quite often, that with intracontinental migration is seen as a security threat in various parts of Africa rather than an opportunity to develop. So that will be, in my view, the main tool of using. And then, of course, it's already been one of the drivers behind a more open view of migration is culture. Young people and cultural expression is a global phenomenon today in a way it's never been before. I think that's also something that can be used in changing the perception of migration.
Thank you very much, Torbjörn. We are nearing the end of this webinar. Perhaps if Jesper, would like to add anything to this latest question about possible solutions, possible solutions to facilitate safe migration. Just 30 seconds or so.
Right, thanks a lot. Well, I think Torbjörn covered a lot of the important ground here. I would just add that there is a lot more conversation among migration specialists around these issues. And one idea that keeps coming back is this idea of skills partnerships. I agree with Torbjörn that migration and mobility within the continent is where the focus should be. But when we talk about South-North migration, I think it makes sense to think of the labor sectors in Europe, for example, that are actually in need of labor. And it's important to appreciate that you can have both unemployment and underemployment in the same economy, right? So there are some sectors that are underemployed and some where people find themselves unemployed. So that's, again, a narrative that needs to be communicated at the European level, that it's not a threat to native jobs to bring in migrant labor in the sectors that are actually lacking. So just to add an aspect on the South-North perspective.
Excellent. Thank you. This has been super interesting, truly. There are more issues to be discussed, of course, like circular migration that you were touching upon, Jesper, and other things like safe pathways to Europe. And there are so many aspects of this issue. But to wrap this seminar up, I would like each of you panelists for a key takeaway here from the discussion, a key takeaway to leave with the audience, simply. So let's start with you, Ahuna.
Well, I mean, very, very interesting. As Jasper said, there needs to be more conversation. But I think for me, it is this idea that the power of people's dreams is much stronger and bigger than the perceived threat of migrating irregularly. So we have to run the development race to the very end. We cannot stop halfway. And we must fight against inequality and exclusion. I think one thing that we should register in this discussion is that exclusion is costly and it is dangerous. And a world where we see more and more people in the margins, in the periphery, excluded, it's a world where we'll see a more dangerous landscape and a costly landscape on human mobility. So how we get around that, I think I totally agree with my fellow panelists that it's human mobility must be seen. We need to change the prism as driving development, not development used to conquer human mobility, which is unfortunately how the policy rhetoric is going now. You know, we must deploy development to stop migration. The more development we have, the more people will be resourced to move. But that move should not be perceived as a threat. It must be perceived as a contribution to enriching the development process. And so that's, for me, the biggest takeaway here is that we have to generate platforms for a new discourse on policies that you see migration differently, whether irregular or regular. But irregular migration must be tackled through safer pathways because no one wants irregular migration. It's dangerous for people. It does create a crisis. But the only way we're gonna avert that is if we invest in safer pathways and circular migration, which are all those tools that are already there in the frameworks that we have.
Okay, so I give the floor to you, Torbjörn.
A bit on the same theme, but I think, I mean, addressing my own industry, if you want, we have to move away from thinking of migration as something to do with humanitarian response, rather think about it as something that has to do with development. Of course, we need to do both. But I mean, the traditional thinking is that this is a cost, this is a burden, and we are good people because we solve these problems. But we need to start looking at the opportunities. I think that goes for the European or Swedish debate as well. Then a personal takeaway, which is quite important, is the connection. I mean, when Jesper explained the history of legal and illegal African migrants in Europe, that's extremely telling. That there's if we stop the legal ways of migrating, probably we'll see illegal migration increasing as a receipt of that policy. So that very important takeaway, I think. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Jesper, what's your takeaway?
Yeah. Thank you. Personally, my main takeaway is that there is so much common ground in the perceptions we've been discussing here today. Although we are positioned in different industries and different with different mandates, etc. So I think that synergy is important just to take note of and use. And then, since much of what I would have said has already been said by Ahuna and Torbjörn, I would just add that I think we have to face the fact that the deadlock between the European Union view and the African perspectives on migration governance are still in kind of a deadlock, and it's a very unproductive deadlock between the two. And I think the proposed EU Pact for Asylum and Migration doesn't really do a lot to solve that, because it still works in the way that we first need to solve the problem of irregular migration before we can talk more about enhancing legal pathways, for example. And as Torbjørn just said, my perspective would be that the most efficient way of combating irregular migration would be to provide other options, safer and more regular options. So there is this deadlock, and my takeaway would be that this creates a space for example, for the UN agencies to act from a different perspective than as implicated in that deadlock. And what is notable is that we had just 2 years ago, we had the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration negotiated. There was some drama around it. There were some countries who ended up not signing, but it's still a very solid framework which brings the SDG agenda into migration governance at the global level. So I think remembering that platform and using it to not get caught up in the deadlock between the EU and the African perspective, I think might be an important avenue to explore going forward.
Thank you. And to the listeners and viewers, before you go, we would like to ask you for some quick feedback. If you look in the chat box now, you will see a link to a brief survey. And there are still 2 minutes remaining on of the webinar, so we would be very grateful if you could use that time to tell us how we did. And on behalf of the co-hosts, I would like to thank our speakers and all the participants who joined us online today on this webinar. Thank you very much, all of you.